order. We're now sitting in public. Proceedings are being broadcast. Today we will consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We'll then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence for publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions before the oral evidence sessions. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without debate.
Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill.
Thank you. I first call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in the Minister's name, which was discussed yesterday by the Programming Subcommittee for this bill. The question is that the programme motion as on the amendment papers. Many of that opinions say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
I beg to move.
The question is the motion as on the amendment papers. Many of that opinions say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I now call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private.
I beg to move.
Many of that opinions say aye. I take it that we don't need to have a session about who's going to ask what questions. Your order's happy just to dig in straight away and start straight away. Okay? So, I remind members that questions are not limited as to what is in the brief, but your questions must be within the scope of the bill. For each panel of witnesses, I propose to call the Shadow Minister to ask the first question, then I will call the Minister and the Liberal Democrat spokesman. I'll then go back and forth between the government and opposition sides. Anyone who wants to ask a question should catch our eye, please. And we'll put you on a list and we'll try and get everybody in, so don't worry about that. Anything? Everybody happy? Nobody want to raise anything? Okay. We will stick to the cut-off time specified in the programme motion. So I'll have to interrupt questioning if necessary. Can I remind members that they must declare any relevant interests? If there are no further questions, we'll call the first set of witnesses in. We are now sitting in public again and the proceedings are being broadcast. Do any members wish to make a declaration of interest? Yes.
Just for the record, NAHT was my previous employer before I came here.
Thank you. If any, sorry, yes?
Just for the record, I'm still County Council there, and they have responsibility for children's services.
Okay. And obviously, if there are any interests particularly relevant to members questioning a speech, they should declare them again at the appropriate time.
Bishop.
Sorry.
I'm currently at GMB Union. Was a workplace rep for a school before the election.
Everybody happy? All right. We will now hear oral evidence from Dr. Carol Homden, Chief Executive Officer for Coram, and Anne Longfield, Executive Chair for the Centre for Young Lives. So do you want to briefly introduce yourselves and perhaps say a word or two about your work, just a word or two, before we start any questioning?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Anne Longfield, as you say. I should also probably say I'm a newly appointed Labour peer. I probably should declare that. I have campaigned for children's issues for many decades, as several of you around this table will know. And many of the measures within the bill are things that I have actively advocated for the last 15 years plus. Some of them, such as breakfast clubs, double that amount of time and half of that amount of time around the register too. So most of my work and interests are around early intervention, around supporting the most vulnerable children and helping children and their families to thrive.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Carol Homden. I'm the Group Chief Executive of Coram, which is the first and longest continuing children's charity, and today a group of specialist organisations dedicated to the legal and practical support of the rights and welfare of children. So the evidence that I shall present to you is based on our direct work in legal advice and advocacy services, care planning, placement and personal, social and health education across 2,800 schools, as well as the extensive research conducted with young people by the Coram Institute for Children. Broadly, Coram welcomes the provisions of the bill, but calls for specific extension and amendments to increase focus on the timescales and needs of our youngest children, and to strengthen its responsiveness to the priorities of children and young people themselves for improved wellbeing support and particularly access to advocacy. And overall, that the outcomes for children should be our central purpose rather than preferences or outcomes for the system.
Thank you very much. So we'll start our questioning now. Neil O'Brien.
Thank you and good morning. Question first for Dr. Homden. You talked about some of the things you'd like to see amended in the bill. I wonder if you could expand upon that, and particularly your point about the timeliness of intervention.
Yes, thank you. Particularly, we are concerned that some of the very sensible provisions in the bill, such as breakfast clubs, are not extended to infants in the early years. So there are a number of areas where early years extension would be appropriate. So whilst we recognise that this is a children's wellbeing and schools bill, nonetheless the children's wellbeing elements for the youngest children are particularly important. So in particular, the opportunities for children to receive free meals and also for the extension of admissions priority. The provisions for the extension of recognition of quality for teaching staff could and should be extended to early years workforce issues. The second key area is the fact that there are no provisions in relation to children's access to advocacy, particularly 16 and 17-year-olds, those who are excluded from school, and those who face other forms of crisis in, for example, unregulated accommodation. So whilst others will call for broader extensions of advocacy, these are the focus areas which we would recommend and commend to you as being the most effective ways to ensure that young people have the information that they need to exercise decision making and that they can hold the system to account.
I just have a quick follow-up question, specifically about some of the things in the bill about family group decision-making, a thing that a lot of people are generally very supportive of.
Yes.
And I suppose my only slight concern about it is at what stage in the process that happens, and whether, if you have that at the point where you're seeking a court order, that is possibly too late in the process, where it's no longer a voluntary or consensual process. And I just wonder if you thought that might be something we could look at bringing forward in the process, or you mentioned young children, whether it's something that needs to happen much earlier, particularly for the under-twos and the particularly vulnerable child in dangerous households.
That is indeed an extremely valid point. Many local authorities will offer family group decision-making support prior to pre-proceedings. And it's important that the new duty introduced does not take away earlier opportunities to extend the involvement of the family network when children's services are involved. And indeed, timescales are acknowledged to be of critical importance in family law, and statutory guidance should make clear that nothing in the family group decision-making requirement or the provisions of the bill should slow down processes or delay solutions for babies and children. But overall, we support the promotion of the family-first decision-making approach, but do point out that whilst we understand that it is the preference not to specify a particular model, we point out that the evidence from the randomised control trial that Coram conducted is in relation to family group conferencing, and that that evidence shows very clearly the importance of independent support and of consistent and sufficient practice. So we do call upon the consideration of the ways in which there will be a strengthening of consistency and quality of approach to ensure that this really meets the needs of children and families. It's also worth remembering that family group decision-making will not necessarily divert children from care. And there has been a significant increase in kinship foster placements, now representing 19% of all active households. But all of our casework in the Coram Children's Legal Centre demonstrates that family group conferencing and indeed well-delivered family group decision-making most certainly helps.
Can I, if I may, just briefly add my support to that. There's widespread support for upholding the principles of family group conferencing, and it is, in my experience, an intervention that can transform children and families' experience at that point and really avert decisions being made to them without their involvement, including children. But it has to be done properly. So we all want families to be involved, but this is something which is around a process around involving families and children in solutions, and that will have a point where it needs to get over in terms of the mechanisms around it and the actual formality of that. So there is something there that there's widespread support for strengthening.
And do you share Dr. Homden's concern that we should be very clear that this shouldn't delay decision making?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Remind, just catch the clerk's eye if you want to ask a question, because we're going to try and get everybody in during the morning, get everybody the same crack of the whip. Okay, so it's important that if you want to get in, you catch his eye. Now, call the Minister to ask a question too.
Thank you. Good morning. Firstly to you, Dr. Carroll. On introduction of the bill, Coram said the bill presents a new opportunity for services and agencies working to protect vulnerable children to work together and make it a reality. Can you outline the key measures that you feel support that within the bill?
Yes, well, clearly there are a number of ways in which the bill is seeking to do that. Quite often what we're looking for here is a strengthening of approaches that reinforce integrated working in local arrangements. So there is a question in our mind around which you have clearly considered, about whether it is essential or not for education to be treated as a core partner in safeguarding. And our consideration is that under Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights, schools have a protective duty. But this should not diminish the clarity and reinforcement of the importance of roles being defined locally and of the activation of best practice in those circumstances. And I repeat that in many areas, particularly in relation to school exclusion, where it is particularly critical that the roles of schools are appreciated in relation to criminal exploitation. It is our suggestion to you that direct access to advocacy for those young people may also be a more timely and potentially more sufficient approach to complement local arrangements in supporting these young people's safeguarding.
Okay, thank you. What have you given in terms of consideration to the impact that creating a duty for safeguarding partners to make arrangements to establish multi-agents child protection teams will have?
Well, having a duty most generally would be reinforcement to the fact that these arrangements are expected and required. And they do not, the duty does not in itself necessarily prejudge the nature of those local arrangements, but it does place a really clear focus on the need to have those arrangements and to make sure that they are functioning properly. We would be pleased to send you some additional reflections on that if that would be helpful. I did just want to raise one point, however, in relation to safeguarding, which is we are concerned that the bill does present an important opportunity, potentially, to remove the defence of reasonable chastisement for children, and in our view this opportunity should not be missed.
Okay, thank you. And to you, Anne, the Centre for Young Lives has welcomed the bill, stating it addresses the issues that have been very concerned about for many years, including vulnerable children falling through the gaps and into danger. Could you elaborate on how you feel the bill better protects children and keeps them safe?
Well, I mean, I'm pleased to say that safeguarding does clearly run through the whole bill, and engagement in the kind of activities around school in the community is one of those ways that children will be safeguarded. The register in itself is something which I campaign for, has been committed for some time. So I'm very pleased to see that in there. I mean, I must say that isn't the, it's not a silver bullet when it comes to children that are out of school, because they're often out of school for a reason, and that doesn't divert from the root causes. But nonetheless, that is a very welcome move. The link between poverty and non-attendance in school, in our experience, has a great link to parents being very worried of not being able to afford branded uniform. That again is supported within here, and the various measures around children's social care as well, including the partnerships that you just discussed. I do think there's a clear reset here around early intervention, which really do very much welcome, and around a much greater coordination and relationship between schools, whatever their structures, and local partners, which can only add to the safety of children. There is a lot of interest in the potential to have a wellbeing measure in here, which I think would further strengthen the bill's ability to be able to identify those children who are vulnerable and enable those partnerships and those services to be able to respond. That is something which I think would be a very welcome addition. That would also support the whole ambition around belonging for children. And for those children who are falling through the gaps, it would give them an opportunity to be able to have their voices heard. I'm thinking around, for example, almost a million children who end up NAHT, which none of us would want to see at that early age. Their involvement in advocating for their own experience of careers and other services would be very welcome. That's part of the engine, I think, that would drive many of the ambitions within the bill. So that in itself would be an addition that would be very much welcomed.
So if I could support that, Minister. Coram also supports the introduction of the register for home-educated pupils as the critical protection to children's right to education and safeguarding. But this should include children with special educational needs and disabilities, since all too often formal education, home education rather, feels like the only option available in the context of risk to the child from their own anxiety, from self-harm or from bullying, and where appropriate, school places being not available or commonly not resourced. We would also further support the reintroduction of the National Adoption Register to ensure that all children waiting receive a proactive matching service without sequential geographical or financial decision-making being involved in that, and reinforce and support what Anne has said about the importance of measurement of well-being. It is clear from our research that young people's well-being is associated with being included in decision-making. So that actually could be, needs to be thought about in relation to the family group decision-making process for older young people. And this gives them much greater sense of traction and optimism for the future.
That's fine.
My main objective is to try and get all the backbenchers in, all right? So we just want crisp questions from the front bench spokesman and from you, please, because it's very important that everybody feels they can get in. So I'll now call the Liberal Democrat spokesman, Ian Solomon, please. Oh, it's Munira. Okay.
Sorry?
Which one is doing it?
Me.
All right, you're the spokesman. Okay.
Thank you. Anne and indeed Dr. Homden, you both reference well-being. It's called the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, but there's precious little in here on well-being. What more, other than a measurement and making sure children's voices are at the forefront, can we be doing or pressing the government for on well-being in this bill?
Well, there are some very well established now wellbeing measures that are now, such as Be Well, that are operating many areas that are cost effective and are really demonstrating what can be achieved with better understanding and information about children's needs, We're going to have the potentially the unique identifier, which again is important within that. But the wellbeing bill, the wellbeing measure overall, would seek to identify which children were vulnerable. It would identify which children were happy and thriving within their community and within their school. It would identify those children who are in need of early help, especially around mental health. And around other support. And it would also enable services to understand where they need to prioritise their resources and their priority. You can't prioritise your response to children's needs unless you know which children need it. So it would, again, as I say, create the engine of many of the outcomes that this bill is seeking to deliver on.
Could I have one more? Dr. Homden, you talked about the lack of provision for children with special educational needs. What do you make of the power in this bill for local authorities to refuse parents the right to withdraw their children from a special school to home educate if those parents don't feel that the special school is meeting their children's needs?
That is a really complex area to consider because the circumstances of the individual children, such as my own, who was not withdrawn from school but had no available provision for 2 years of his school life, despite being fully known and documented. And I sympathise with parents who are in a situation where the risks that they feel that their child has in a setting as well as out of a setting might lead them to that position. So I do sympathise strongly with the driver within the bill, but I think much more consideration needs to be given to that question because of the lack of provision. And in the Coram Children's Legal Centre, we are constantly representing parents where there is significant failure to fulfil the education, health and care plan, which is a child's right and entitlement.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time, so
Okay.
we'll go to Lizzie Collins now.
A question for Anne, who you said that the family group decision making can be fantastic if done well. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on about how prescriptive should the statutory guidance be about the format of those family group decision meetings?
Well, I do think it has to be, if this is this going to be the cornerstone of being able to move towards a kinship model and about being able to intervene earlier and get alongside families, it has to work properly. And all the evidence is based on a system which is around full family group conferencing. Now, of course, you'd want to take any opportunity to work around families and get their involvement. But this is about planning, it's about being at the right time, it's about having the involvement of children and families, and that not being something that local authorities themselves can decide on, if you like. But it's also about that commitment to do something with it. And I think without that, it could be a meeting with families. And that would just be an absolute missed opportunity. I'm not a specialist in this. I went along and found family group conferencing about 12, 15 years ago. I used to call them magic meetings. Out of nowhere came solutions that changed people's lives, not wanting to become too enthused about that. But I think it has to be done right. That doesn't mean that, it's the principles of it, and the absolute principles need to see through.
Okay, we'll carry on now for crisp questions and answers, one each, please. Ellie Chowns.
Thank you. You've enthused about family group decision making. Do you think it would be useful at other stages in the process, particularly approaching family reunification at the point of discharge of care?
Yes, we would support that. We would also call for specific coverage in the statutory guidance on how children with family members abroad can benefit, and for consideration in that on contact, particularly with siblings.
I mean, I'd also look at the mechanism at other points as well, when children were at risk of becoming involved in crime and the like. But, for now, yes.
Thank you. Darren Paffley.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about the requirement for local authorities to offer staying close. We've seen some success of this in Southampton, but I wonder, from your direct work that both your organisations have done, does the staying close offer meet the most pressing needs of care leavers, or are there other things that the bill should consider?
Carol will talk about the detail of this probably more than me, but I mean, in principle terms, it was really important change to be made, a really important commitment. It's something which young people that I've met have appreciated and seen the value of. I don't think it's yet to the point where most care leavers would say that it's meeting all their ambitions, and nor, of course, is it anywhere. So having it as part of this bill to extend that, to strengthen it, is important. But it's something which is there to be built upon, and we know from the outcomes for young people leaving care that it's absolutely crucial that level of stability and support is in place. But Carol, from practice.
Yes, we support the extension of support to care leavers in this bill. And provisions do need to ensure greater consistency across the country in their support that is offered. It will be important that the introduction of stay-in-case provisions, that this will, in this case, will only be offered to care leavers where the authority assesses such support is required, and it's important that this does not dilute the very important role and responsibilities of personal advisors. So young people speak very passionately in our Bright Spot surveys about the importance of the emotional and practical support that they provide. And so we must take care that this is not undermined. Staying close must mean what is close for the individual. And this also extends to the issues of the legal duties to publish a local offer, which already exists. But really the question is, can we achieve greater consistency and transparency for young people? So, for example, our young people in the National Voice, the National Children in Care Council, have been campaigning on the fact that almost 2 years after the Department for Education announced the increase for their setting up home grants, there are still 10% of local authorities not applying that. And therefore, all too often, these young people experience a form of postcode lottery. And finally, that our research has shown huge disparity in relation to the appreciation of levels of disability and long-term health conditions amongst care leavers. And this needs to be a really key area of focus.
Thank you, Chair. Family group decision making is well evidenced practice, yet this bill mandates it. Do we really need a bill to mandate it, especially when considering that a lot of children come into these situations where they are at risk of neglect from their carers? Can't the virtue and the hope of this kind of amendment and the idea of family group decision making be instructed through guidance? Does it need to be mandated through a bill?
Can I do a warm-up for you?
Yes.
You can obviously come in on the practice. I think it does need to be mandated because I think it is, again, at the cornerstone of the different way of working. It is about intervening earlier, and the majority of families in that situation are actually living with adversity and not coping with adversity. The whole ambition behind this is about bringing not only direct family, not parents, but families around them and others.
What about children who are at risk of neglect at the hands of the carer? Do you think family group decision making is an appropriate step that a child safeguarding team should be mandated to practice at that point?
Well, I think a mandate makes a very clear distinction in terms of a route of travelling, and it's well evidenced. Carol will talk about the risk, if you like, to families, but to children, but it's the broader family and in some cases other support network. And of course, the family...
I'm going to interrupt you there. We've still got two more people. Okay. I want to get them in. Amanda Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's key that we need strong partnerships to stop children slipping through the cracks. It happens far too often. What do you think the impact will be of creating that duty of safeguarding for partnerships to establish the multi-agency child protection teams, and what lessons must we learn?
Sorry.
Well, I think we will need to send you a further briefing on that point beyond what I've already said. The point is that if there is a duty, then you are creating a framework within which there is a much stronger accountability, assuming that this is carefully inspected, considered, and indeed that acted upon if it is not implemented. I go back to the previous point to say I sympathise with this. The welfare of the child is paramount, and local authorities have an absolute duty to act irrespective of any other duties upon them to ensure the safety of a child in those acute circumstances. But the bill protects against that and makes that clear, and mandating family group decision making makes sure that best practice in time becomes the only practice.
Thank
you, Chair. Good morning. In your view, are the measures in the bill proportionate in order to try and improve child safeguard and protect children? In terms of the spend on looked after children, we know in the last decade or so it's increased from about £3.5 billion to over £8 billion a year that local authorities are spending. Do you think the measures in the bill will help to address that and bring that down?
So I'd say they begin to address that and bring that down, because we are in a situation which is quite extreme. We know the level of spend on children in care is very high, and we know it's not sustainable for the majority, for any of us, for the public purse. We also know that it's not the best outcomes for a lot of children. If early intervention had been in place, it could have been a very different situation. So I think it's proportionate for a first stage. I think there's much more that can be done, and there's things around interventions that we could be putting there, around sufficiencies around play, around mental health support, around children's centres and family hubs, that would really be able to start to extend that into something which was able to get beyond this first stage.
So in your view, it doesn't go too far, it doesn't go far enough in some cases?
I think it's proportionate for now, but I think it needs to be strengthened in areas if we're going to tackle some of the deep-rooted issues we know a lot of children are facing. Yeah.
And in terms of the spend, in terms of overall spend?
I think the only way to get around the spend in local authorities on children's social care is to reduce those costs. I don't think that's necessarily about I don't think that's to deny children's needs. I think it's about a different way. We know that the spending on early intervention has almost halved over the last decade, and the cost of crisis has doubled. A lot of that cost is on residential provision for older children, and for me that needs to be a focus on where we intervene early and find alternative solutions with families.
Thank you.
Last question, Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Chair. Before I was elected, I run a domestic abuse and mental health charity, so I can definitely speak to the value of the mandate, even in a local authority setting, which was excellent. But my question is around whether the other measures in this bill are proportionate to that aim of driving local integration and making sure that the child is at the centre of all decision making. And that's to you, Anne.
Yeah, so there are a number of the other interventions that we could include in here that I think would strengthen children's participation and children being at the centre of their communities. One of those is around children's play. We know that children's access to play has reduced dramatically over recent years, and play being the thing that children say they want at the top of their list. We know that we were really very worried about access to play and the dominance of social media in children's lives. In Wales, they introduced a play sufficiency duty in 2010. It wasn't a huge cost. It meant that local authorities had to plan for play and respond to play, and that kind of strategy would be something which, for a first stage here, would be a very cost-effective way of reflecting children's needs in the community.
That's in 2 minutes, Damien.
Thank you very much, Edward. We talked a little earlier about the measurement of well-being. Obviously, there are surveys of children's well-being that happen now in various organisations. Your old organisation, the Children's Commissioner's Office, does something. Prince's Trust does something. UNICEF have done an international survey, and so on. Just wonder what, in particular, is the output of the surveys you envisage would be used for, and also if you might say a word about the a report that does exist at the moment, the Children and Young People as Mental Health Prevalence Survey, wave 4 of which was most recently published by the NHS, and the future of which is uncertain. I just wonder if you would like to see that series of surveying and reporting carrying on.
Yes, we would. I mean, it is incredibly important that we're able to account for the implementation and whether or not this bill actually does help us to improve children's well-being. It is also extremely important that that is happening systematically across local services and in any area where we can in fact respond to and adapt services to meet the needs of children. So generally we do feel that it's extremely important that well-being measurement is advanced and made more systematic and consistent.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the session. I thank our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now hear oral evidence from Andy Smith, President of the Association of Directors of Children's Services, and Ruth Stanier, Assistant Director of Policy of the Local Government Association. And again, we must stick to the timings, and this session must end at 10:30. So do you want to very briefly introduce yourself, both of you, please?
Yeah, morning everybody. My name's Andy Smith. I'm the President of the Association of Directors of Children's Services, and my day job is the Director of Children's Services and Adult Social Services in Derby.
And I'm Ruth Stanier, Assistant Policy Director at the Local Government Association.
Thank you very much. Neil O'Brien.
Good morning and thank you for coming. We have an important principle in local government called the New Burdens Doctrine, which is that if government puts a burden on a local government, it pays for it. And I wanted to ask you, firstly, whether you agreed that, given the various new duties and obligations on local government in this bill, that principle should be followed here and that local government should be funded to implement those duties. And secondly, I wanted to get your understanding of what the current situation was and whether there was funding being offered to implement the different duties in this bill.
Thank you very much. An extremely important question. So we very much welcome many of the measures in this bill which we've long been calling for, but they must be appropriately resourced in order for them to actually have the impact that we want. So absolutely, yes, the new Burdens Doctrine...
Would you like to see that in this bill? Would you do the resourcing clearly specified?
So you're absolutely right that the new Burdens Doctrine must be applied in the usual way. There are a number of measures in this bill where additional funding will be required. For example, the new multi-agency units, just to cite one. We're encouraged that we're already at this stage having early discussions with the department about the implementation arrangements. We're yet to undertake the full estimates, the cost estimates, but that work will be set in train with the department.
That's very helpful. On Clause 18, the regulations on agency workers and their pay, we'd all like to be able to spend less on the cost of all these different things. But even though we might be sympathetic to the ideas of the bill, would you agree with me that if you just attempt to control prices, if you just cap prices and you don't take action on supply, then of course that will fail because the underlying cause of the high prices is everything to do with supply and planning over time? I wonder if Andy wanted to take that.
I think you have to cover both. I think it's been incredibly important and it's been positive that the government has taken forward measures to tackle the costs of agency workers, and we're seeing the impact of the measures that have taken place already. So, for example, just in my region on Friday, we were talking about the implications and the impact of the changes that started to be implemented, and we're seeing less churn of workers moving from one authority to another. We're seeing some agency workers move over to the permanent books of councils, and that is better for children. But it's also important to ensure that we've got a sufficient approach and strategy for the workforce generally that covers all elements of the bill. So that would include social work, but also other professions as well in other agencies where we have got some particular challenges. So yes, absolutely, we need to focus on the recruitment and the retention of social workers, as well as to tackle the costs of agency workers, which I believe are already underway and making some impact.
Any other ways you'd like to see this bill amended?
I think there are some things missing from the bill. I think there are some things that are going to be positive, and we'll no doubt come to those things. I think what was disappointing from the policy paper to where we are now is the lack of corporate parenting. We would have expected to have seen all government departments committing to corporate parenting, and we see that as a real disappointment, actually. It feels like a once in certainly a generation time for us to really focus on that wider responsibility that all departments should have for our children in care. So I think that's a particular gap at the moment in the bill.
And Ruth?
I very much agree on extending the corporate parenting duty. This must be the right time and the right bill to do that, and the government has already committed to do so in a recent policy paper, so really important to get that included. We were also disappointed that the bill doesn't have powers for Ofsted to be able to inspect multi-academy trusts, as was the government election manifesto commitment. We support the similar new powers relating to care placement providers, but in respect of trust, that is an omission. I'm sure you'll want to come on to discuss the elective home education provisions, which we do support, but there could be scope for those to go further. In an ideal world, councils would have the power to visit any child where there were concerns. Obviously that would need to be appropriately resourced, but there could be scope to go further on that particular provision.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and thank you both for being witnesses before the committee. A question to you both. What impact do you think this bill will have on those children and their families entering or at risk of entering children's social care system?
Shall I come in first for that, Minister? I think that a strength in the bill is the focus on family help and early intervention. We talk a lot about the cost of the care system, but actually we need to see this in a much more strategic context and strategic sense. And actually we know there's a lot of evidence. We published some research just last week which shows that those councils that have been able to invest and maintain early help services, it has a direct impact then on reducing children coming into the more statutory end of things, so within children's social care, within the looked after children service. The challenge we've got is that we've got a real variability around early help services across the country because of the difficulties there have been in council budgets over the past 10 years. So actually seeing these reforms and seeing family help in its totality, and then going back to the earlier question around the funding required to implement the reforms, I think will make a positive impact. And that's ultimately better for children to remain with their families. And if not, then there's a big focus on kinship care, for example, so children remain within their family network. So it is a real strength, I think, in the bill.
Yes, completely agree with that, and we very much support the measures in relation to support for kinship families. We think that's a very important area.
Thank you both. And secondly, currently, how do local authorities discharge their duty to ensure children receive a suitable education, and what impact do you think the measures in the bill will have on this?
So we very much support the new duty to cooperate across councils and all schools. This is something we've long been calling for. Of course, councils continue to have duties to ensure that there is appropriate education for every child in local places, and being able to have that statutory underpinning set out in the bill, the cooperation across all schools is so important, particularly important when we're thinking also about councils' duties in respect of SEND, where obviously the system is under enormous strain, as was illustrated by a very important report we commissioned jointly with the County Councils Network last year. So we very much welcome those measures in the bill. Thank you.
And just to add to that, Minister, if I may, I think the education system in England is increasingly fragmented and lacks coherence. And we've seen the role of the local authority essentially eroded, even though our duties essentially haven't changed that much. So I think the measures in the bill are going to be very helpful in terms of trying to bring some of that coherence back, and also to recognise really the role of the local authority around directing of academies, around school-placed planning, around admissions. Because the current system works for some children, but it doesn't work for all. So I think trying to kind of rebalance that is a positive step forward.
Munira.
Thank you, Chair. The Register of Children Not in School is supported by many parties and many organisations. But as Clause 25 is currently set out, there's a huge amount of detailed information that's being requested of parents. In your professional view, Andy, do you think your directors of children's services need all this information in order to safeguard children? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, ADCS has long argued for a register of electively home-educated children, and for several years we carried out a survey ahead of this information being collected by the department, and we know the numbers of children that are being electively home-educated has increased exponentially, particularly since the pandemic. I think we need to be really kind of clear that the measures in itself are not going to protect children or keep children safe. The child protection powers are welcome, but we also need to think about the capacity and the resource that's going to be required to visit children in their homes, the training that will be required for staff that are going out doing the visiting so they can kind of tune into issues around safeguarding and general well-being. The measures in the bill certainly are very detailed in terms of what's contained in a register, and I think there's some reflection really around whether or not there needs to be such a level of detail captured. That in itself isn't going to keep children safe, and I think there's also some reflection really about the relationship that local authorities have with parents, because if you think about the reasons why children are being electively home educated, that's kind of shifted. We kind of moved away from a philosophical kind of reason that parents might decide to home educate. Often children are being home educated because of bullying, because of mental health challenges, because they're being encouraged by schools to electively home educate, and often, and we're seeing an increasing proportion of children with SEND who are also being electively home educated because parents aren't getting the provision that they want, it's not available, or because of the tribunal processes. And the kind of relationship that local authorities have with parents in the kind of SEND context is quite challenging, and yet the local authority will be going in then to the family home, and different officers are asking lots of questions about the kind of nature of education. So I think there's some reflection around the detail. I think what local authorities do need is much clearer guidance on what a good elective home education offer looks like, so there's greater consistency across the piece, because at the moment we just haven't got that because we're talking about very old legislation.
Ruth, there are powers given to the Secretary of State in this bill, if necessary, to implement profit capping on private providers of children's care homes and fostering agencies. It's very clear that there is a huge amount of profiteering. Do you think this is the right way to go about to tackle that issue? And what could this mean in terms of sufficiency of places?
So we very strongly support those measures in the bill. We've been calling for them for some time. I think just taking those powers sends such an important signal to the market in and of itself. But should that of itself not have the desired impact, clearly, then we hope the department will go on to actually put regulations in place. The level of costs has just spiralled out of control, leaving councils in an absolutely impossible situation. So it is excellent that these measures are being brought forward. We also very much welcome the measures in the bill to put in place greater oversight of providers, because clearly there is that risk of collapse which could have catastrophic impacts on children in those placements. Clearly, though, this of itself does not solve the problems with sufficiency in the numbers of placements, and we're continuing to work very closely with the department on measures to tackle that.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Chair. With your experiences in mind, do you think it's right that local authorities at the moment can only seek proposals for academies if it's to open a new school, or as is the case in this bill, we can now invite proposals potentially from other types of school? What implications do you think that will have for pupils?
So we again very much welcome this measure in the bill, which again we have long called for. I mean, clearly councils continue to have the duty to ensure that places are available for all local children, and having that flexibility where it's appropriate to bring forward new maintained schools is clearly helpful.
I mean, just to add to that, if I may, I think that ADCS's view is that the education system must absolutely be rooted in place. DCS's local officers know its place really, really well. And I think the measures in the bill around direction of academy schools, for example, is a welcome addition moving forward. I think the end to the legal presumption that new schools will become academies, allowing proposals from local authorities and others, is very welcome. And you know, local authorities understand planning really well and understand its place and its children really well. And I think that will ultimately be better for children, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask about elective home education, just very quickly first. So we're going to legislate in this bill for the provision of breakfast at primary schools. Have either of your two organisations received any guarantees about the future of existing support for breakfast clubs in secondary schools, or for the future of the holiday activities and food programme?
So we very much welcome the provisions in this bill around breakfast clubs. We think it's incredibly important that...
Forgive me, it was a different question, but my question was...
I'm sorry,
we know the legislation proposes this for primary school breakfast. My question was, have you heard anything, have you had any guarantees about the future of existing support for breakfast clubs in secondary schools in underprivileged areas, or for the holiday activities and food programme?
So on the first of those issues, I'm not aware of any such guarantees or representations, and I can see the point you're making, which is important. In respect of holiday activities, I've seen recent media coverage, which seems potentially positive. Clearly, we very much want that support to remain in place.
Thank you. Andy?
I mean, my view would be similar to Ruth. I'm not aware in relation to the first question, and I think, the evidence and the impact of HAF is so tangible. I think, we would absolutely strongly support that continuing for the most vulnerable children.
Thank you. But turning to elective home education, if I may, as Munira Wilson said, there's a great deal of detail in the bill about information that would be required of parents and allocation of individual parents' time, for example, dedicated to the education of that child and so on. You, Andy, I think, diplomatically said perhaps we needed some reflection on this text. I wonder if you might reflect out loud and say perhaps if you think it goes into perhaps an unnecessary level of detail which might be considered rather onerous on parents who are home educating, sometimes in very difficult circumstances, and indeed onerous on your colleagues in local government. And have you made an estimate of how much cost would come with this system?
We haven't made an estimate about how much cost would come with the system. I mean, clearly there would need to be a new burdens assessment on any changes, because you can't do these reforms on the cheap. That's really important to make that point. I think that in previous surveys that we've done to local authorities on elective home education, I mean, it's evident that over the last 10 to 12 years, the capacity has been hollowed out. So you're often talking about, not even a full-time post. In my authority, for example, around EHE, we have less than one FTE worker who goes out and knocks on doors and tries to talk to parents. If you were then putting in or superimposing the changes that are envisioned by the bill, that would be significantly insufficient. And this is much more than an administrative task, because some councils will have an admin like type role that will be undertaking this function. So notwithstanding whether or not there's too much detail currently, if you think about some of the kind of practical things around the visits and around understanding the offer and around just trying to understand what's happening to children to build up that picture, then there would need to be sufficient capacity to get the sufficient workers in post across places to do that, and they need to be sufficiently trained. That's probably more important in terms of that line of sight on the child than having a huge amount of information about the details of mums and dads and carers, if I'm honest.
And a question that often comes up with electively home educating parents is about the support that is or is not available to them in their efforts. And this bill does make provision for support to those parents. But on page 55 of the bill, it says the advice and information to be provided is whatever the local authority considers fit. You yourself mentioned a moment ago that there would be some benefit perhaps in having more consistency across the country. I just wondered again if you might give a few thoughts about what you think is fit in terms of that support. And in particular, a question that often comes up from parents is about entry to examinations.
Well, I think just to offer some reflections, I think that what constitutes a good elective home education offer will be very different depending on the parent and depending on the context and depending sometimes on the rationale around why parents have decided to implement EHE for their child. And I think there should be some consistency around what some of those expectations are. And we know that there are some fantastic enriched opportunities that parents provide their children through EHE, and they're able to also sit exams. And there will be some learning from that. But I think the challenge in this space is that we're not starting with a level playing field. I think, we've moved from a context where we were maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where you had parents who are EHE because of philosophical reasons around that being important for children and for their particular lifestyle. We're now talking about often kids that are not in school because they've been sidelined or because they've been discriminated against or because they're sent or because they're being bullied. So there needs to be, I think, some expectation and understanding around their starting points as well as then what a good offer looks like. And we need to work that through based on the research. We need to try and co-produce that with parents. We need to do that in a way that we think is actually going to be broad enough not to tie parents down, but to ensure that there's some consistency really, particularly then in terms of what the local authority role is and understanding what the impact of that is.
I would just want to stress that if there were to be mandation of councils paying for exam fees, clearly there is a case for that, but that would need to be funded, obviously.
Okay, we've still got 6 keen people wanting to come in, so brief single question and answers, please. Lizzie College.
Thank you, Chair. I draw the committee's attention to the fact that I'm a corporate parent in Lancashire. I'm interested in the powers of financial oversight and profit caps on residential children's homes in particular. What impact do you foresee that having on the resources you have available to look after children?
Well, we do very much expect that these measures should, over time, lead to a reduction in some of the extremely high costs that have been set out in recent research that we've done, which should, of course, free up some additional funding for all the other things that councils need to be doing.
I mean, just to briefly add to that, I mean, if you look at the breadth of measures in the bill around having the right placements for the right type of child in the right part of the country, to have regulations around that, to try and move away from unregulated placements, which we've seen a proliferation of in recent years, over time we should start to see a more consistent provision of accommodation and placements across the country. And of course that focus as well on fostering, on kinship care, on prevention, that whole continuum really that we need for children, obviously with that real focus on trying to keep children out of care in the first place.
Thank you. Ellie Charles.
Clause 8 of the bill specifies that local authorities need to set out a local offer. You've talked about the need to avoid fragmentation and corporate responsibility across the country, across departments. Would you like to see the bill amended to require a national offer of support to care leavers, and what do you think should be in it?
Well, we certainly would, as we've been saying, want to see corporate parenting duties extended at a national level to government departments and relevant public sector bodies. We think that's incredibly important. Otherwise, we're very much supportive of the measures in the bill in respect of kinship offer. We think it's important, though, that there's a clear threshold for that support so that it's realistic and can be implemented and is affordable.
I mean, I would support that. I think that a national offer for care leavers is an interesting concept. I think there should be some absolute minimum requirements that we expect in an offer, and I think that you would broadly see that in many councils in terms of what is provided for children in care and for care leavers, and that is usually co-produced with representatives of usually care leaver councils and so on. So I think that would be a kind of important reflection within the context of a much broader understanding of corporate parenting.
Thank you. Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you. We heard in earlier evidence that we've seen spending on early intervention reduce while seeing kind of crisis costs significantly increase. What impact do you think there will be of early intervention, including family group decision making, primarily on outcomes, but also in the longer term on costs?
We do very much think that the measures on the bill will help to pull funding to the left, further upstream into prevention. We also very warmly welcome the government's recent investment in the Children's Prevention Grant. Over time, we think that these measures in the bill should help to improve outcomes and reduce costs over the longer term.
I mean, just to add to that, Catherine, I think that it's an absolute false economy not to invest in early help and early intervention, because we know that the evidence base is so strong in terms of children then escalating into higher cost services. For example, in my authority, we've invested in early help services. We've got an edge of care team that absolutely target children on the edge of the care system. And then when we're able to prevent them going into care, we track the costs of those children in terms of cost avoidance around what a typical placement might have cost. And, we've saved in excess of £5 million over the last 3 years in terms of cost avoidance. So the case is well argued. I think the challenge is you're starting at different starting points for councils because of the way in which funding has been eroded over the last 10 years, and the fact that many councils have to prioritise the higher cost services, and that often is taken away from early intervention. So it is a false economy. The bill offers us, if we can get the funding right, an opportunity to really start invest in family help, early help services, and really start to see some of those impacts much more consistently. And we're beginning to see some of that from the 12 pilots that are taking place around the Family First.
Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question predominantly for Mr. Smith. Look, I completely agree the need for stable safeguarding teams, and they are in the better interests of children, but can you completely rule out any risk that a statutory cap on the use of agency workers will lead to people leaving the profession?
Well, I can't absolutely rule that out. I mean, we've got significant churn in social work, and that's part of the challenge that we are struggling as a system to recruit and retain social workers. We've got lots of routes into social work. We're doing lots to try and promote the role. I mean, I'm a social worker. I love it. It's brilliant, even though I haven't practiced for a number of years now. So I think the measures in the bill will go some way, both in terms of setting some rules around how and where agency workers are able to, or how and when social workers are able to move into agency social work. But I can't guarantee that it isn't going to, stop or prevent, the churn in the system. But ultimately, I think it's one tool that the bill outlines that will help in terms of that stability that we need to have in the workforce, because that ultimately leads to better outcomes for children.
Okay, Matt Bishop.
Thank you, Chair. With the requirement of registers for EHE students, do you anticipate a sizable decrease in the number of CME, or children missing education numbers?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure that would necessarily follow. I mean, as Andy's been setting out, we just see these very, very clear upward trends at the moment, in part driven by the significant problems within the SEND system and the challenges that many children are facing with the schools that they're in, accessing the support they need, including mental health support. So I'm not sure that would necessarily follow.
I think you've got to overlay the kind of implementation timeline of this bill with what needs to happen around a new system for an inclusive education, because I think that will start to impact on some of the cohorts of children that are missing education or that are being let to be home educated, because there's such a strong SEND component now in a way we didn't see before the pandemic. So I think you've got to kind of overlay the two things to kind of understand what those impacts might start to look like.
Thank you.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Chair. Before the election, I visited Linwood School's Charminster site, and I spoke with a young girl with support needs around SEND. And she told me about a meeting with a social worker, a new social worker, who had asked her how her parent was. And she had to tell the social worker that her parent had died. And this is just one of many examples of social workers who will pick up new cases, not have time to read notes, have constant churn. So we know some of the human costs. Can you speculate or estimate what some of the financial savings would be from reinvesting the money that would be spent on local agency social workers onto a permanent workforce? How much would local councils benefit because of this measure?
Well, I mean, an agency social worker costs around a third more than a social worker on the books of a local authority. So you could extrapolate what that would look like from a team of 8 or 9 social workers to 2 or 3 times that. So it would definitely financially a much better option than having an agency worker. Now, that isn't to say that agency social worker is bad. That's not what I'm saying, because there could well be. And there are occasions when local authorities need to employ agency social workers to cover sickness or maternity leave, or where there's a particular pressure. But it should be an exception rather than the rule. And it's about creating the conditions that actually enable social workers to want to stay on the books of local authorities, as well as putting rules around it so that we can ensure that we've got workers that have got sufficient training, development, and can't move to agencies too quickly before they've had that breadth of experience. So it ultimately would be cheaper to the public purse if we had less agency social workers and we had more social workers on the books, and ultimately better for children as well in terms of consistency and stability, because we want to try and reduce the handoffs and the kind of churn that we see sometimes in the workforce.
Okay, we've got time for one very quick question again.
You've mentioned a couple of times about the change from with elective home education from philosophy to reasons around the provision in school. I just want to understand, do you have thoughts on what accountability there should be for schools on that? Ofsted currently inspect the schools. They're not looking at reasons that children might not be in school electively. Is there some mechanism you see around that?
Programme motion, I'm sorry.
We very much welcome the fact that the government is now asking Ofsted to look specifically at inclusion, and we think it's so important for precisely that reason.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. We'll now hear oral evidence from Julie McCulloch, Senior Director of Strategy, Policy and Professional Development Services at the Association of Schools and College Leaders, and Paul Whiteman, General Secretary of the National Association of Head Teachers. You're very welcome. Do you want to say a brief word introduction, both of you?
Hello. So I'm Paul Whiteman. Just in the context of the bill, we broadly support the provisions within the bill as far as they connect with schools. It builds upon a lot of our policy positions and our policy ambitions for some time. We don't see it as a revolution in education, but broadly sensible provisions.
We're in a similar place at ASCL, so there's much in the bill that aligns with our existing policy positions. We have a few logistical questions, I think, about how some of the proposals might play out, and perhaps some questions about how they sit within the government's broader vision and strategy for education. But in terms of the specific proposals in the bill, we are broadly in favour.
Thank you. Neil O'Brien.
Good morning and thank you for coming. Julie, to your logistical questions, ASCL said in a statement that work will be needed to get these measures right. Further changes must be done with care, not seem ideological. You talked about some of the issues that you wanted to see addressed as we amend this bill. What are they?
So I think they're largely about the fact that these proposals are landing in a particular context. And I think there are kind of three areas where those logistical challenges exist. The first is that they're landing in the context of a system that has been systematically underfunded for many years, and that particularly talks to the proposal around breakfast clubs. So we have some questions there about ensuring there's sufficient funding for breakfast clubs.
Can I just press you on that one? So I don't really understand from the bill yet how it's supposed to work, because obviously many schools in primary schools already offer a breakfast club and they charge for it. So if you are now to offer, I think the going rate is going to be 60p in the first wave, you're supposed to offer 30 minutes and a free breakfast for that. How does that work with the current charging arrangements for schools? Are you allowed to charge, do you understand, before that period? So you'll be both charging and a free session? Is that your understanding of what the bill does?
That's our understanding. Is that yours too? That this will be there will be provision of additional funding here for
so you'll have
children
sort of two tiers.
Most need it, but you can provide provision around that.
And on secondary school breakfast clubs, what is your understanding of the position? Have you had any undertakings on the future of the free school breakfast programme that exists in secondary schools, or indeed the HAF, the whole day and food programme? Is your understanding that there is secure funding for those things?
I'm not sure I'd be as confident as that. I think we've started to have some conversations around that. I'm not sure we've had detailed conversations about that.
You'd welcome greater certainty on those things?
We absolutely would, and continued funding.
Is there anything else that you like amended in the school section of the bill?
So there are two other thoughts, just to finish my thought about the context in which this is landing. The second is the challenges at the moment around recruitment and retention in schools, and I think the proposal here around qualified teacher status, while absolutely welcome and the right thing in principle, we've had some concerns from our members about the challenges of ensuring that can be followed through when they are already really struggling.
Do you think it's sometimes better to have a good professional person who the head thinks is a good teacher rather than no teacher at all?
In some cases, yes, that's a sad place that we find ourselves. But sometimes that is the case, particularly actually when we're looking towards the top end of secondary school and into colleges where we're looking at vocational subjects. There are some excellent teachers and lecturers in further education colleges and in secondary schools on vocational subjects who don't necessarily have qualified teacher status, and we need to make sure that we can retain that.
You can be a good teacher even if you don't have QTS. You can be the right person. Yeah.
Yes, but we absolutely in principle think there should be qualified teacher status, but I think again it's that contextual piece. And then our third area where we just have some concerns about the context is around the you've just heard, I know, from local authority colleagues about the extent to which there is capacity in local authorities at the moment to pick up some of the additional requirements that there might be on them. Again, we don't have any concerns about the principle here, but some concerns from our members about whether that capacity and to some extent that expertise still exists in local authorities.
And well, let's go. Do you have a sense that there are a large number of schools at the moment who are not providing a broad and balanced education? Do you have a sense of how many schools are not following the national curriculum at the moment?
No, absolutely not a significant number at all. So what we hear from our members is that the vast majority do use the national curriculum as their starting point, as a benchmark, and they innovate on top of it.
And what do you think the problem is then that measure is trying to solve?
So our view is that it is right that there should be a core national entitlement curriculum for all children and young people, and we think that is the right thing to do. The devil's in the detail. We're going through a curriculum review at the moment, but our view is that entitlement is important. On the ground, it might not make an enormous amount of difference, but the entitlement is still important.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. When it comes to school admissions, and this is to both of you, do you think the bill measures will better help local authorities be able to fulfil their statutory duties? And could you comment on how you think it will impact on children and schools?
We do think it will help local authorities. We think there's been a gap in terms of their ability to make sure that their admissions duty is fully met. And to that extent, the difficulty of some parents to find the school that their children really should go to has been fettered, and therefore we think these provisions are broadly sensible and to be welcomed.
Yeah, we agree. I think the more join-up we can have between local authorities and schools about admissions, the better. You know, there are some areas where that's working really well already. There are others where I think that statutory duty might help.
Great. And from your experience, do you think it's important that a school's individual circumstances are taken into account when you're determining the best and appropriate action to drive school improvement, where a school may be underperforming, whether it's a maintained school, and that conversion to academy by default might not always be in the best interest of every school and indeed the children within it?
I think it's important to say that to preface my answer, that the success of academies, it can be seen, and the improvement is very, very real, but it's not always the only way to improve school, and we've held that belief for a very long period of time. And the extent to which we rely on data to support one argument or the other, of course it's been the only option for so very long. The only answer is the data is self-serving in that respect. Academisation isn't always a silver bullet. It doesn't always work according to the locality or the status or the circumstances of the school. And we absolutely think that different options are available. The introduction of the RISE teams to offer different support and different ways of support is to be welcomed to see if that support's better. So absolutely, academisation hasn't always been a silver bullet, but really important to preface. That's not an attack on the academy system. There are very good academies and there are excellent local authority maintained schools as well, and we should make sure that we pick the right option for the school in difficulty.
I would start in the same place. I think it's really important to recognise the extent to which the expertise and capacity to improve schools does now sit within multi-academy trusts, not exclusively, but you know, that is where a lot of that capacity sits at the moment. I think it's really important to make sure that we don't do anything that undermines that. But it is our long-standing position that accountability measures shouldn't lead to automatic consequences, that there does need to be a nuanced conversation on a case-by-case basis about the best way to help a struggling school to improve. So we welcome that. I think there are some challenges. You know, I think some members have raised some questions about if that slows down the process to the detriment of the children and young people in those schools who most need support, then clearly that would not be a good place to find ourselves. But in principle, absolutely, it's that sort of nuance as well.
So, thank you.
I think it's just worth adding very quickly, if I may, we do have examples of schools that are in difficult circumstances where an academy chain can't be found for them to accept them in because the challenge is too difficult for an academy to really want to get hold of them.
Leaving aside the register, looking at the schools part of the bill and knowing the challenges your members up and down the country face, do you think the schools part of the bill has the right priorities in terms of the issues we need to be tackling across schools and colleges?
Shall I start that one? I think it has some important priorities, and I think the ones that you've highlighted there are sort of first among those, the register not in school, for example. I think there are certainly other issues that our members would raise with us as being burning platforms at the moment. SEND is absolutely top of that list. Recruitment and retention would be very close behind, and probably accountability would be a third. So those are the three issues that our members raise as the biggest challenges. And I think there are some really important measures in this bill that talk to some of those concerns, certainly recruitment and retention. I think there are some things here that might help with that. But I think it's probably fair to reflect the fact that our members would be keen to see quite quickly some more work around some of those burning platforms.
Can I just press you on that, because you mentioned recruitment and retention as a key issue. We know that's a massive issue. Yet in a previous answer you said your concern around the QTS changes would maybe reduce supply. In your professional judgment, the QTS measures and the constraints on pay and conditions, what impact might that have on recruitment and retention, and what is it that you think will be beneficial for R&R?
So I think there's two different questions. On the QTS measure, I think that is about just recognising the kind of acute situation that we're in, and that in some circumstances our members are saying they have a good member of staff delivering teaching who might not quite meet that don't have QTS, but maybe working towards it. So I think there's some devil in the detail there about where exemptions might be and how the working towards QTS might work. On the changes to around applying the STPCD to academies as well as maintained schools, I think if the way we understand that measure is right, then we think that will help with recruitment and retention. If it is about a floor and not a ceiling, we're not entirely convinced that's how the bill is worded at the moment. No, but if that is the intention and that is how it plays out, then we think that's helpful.
If I may, one more. May
you want to answer that one?
If I may, quickly. Obviously, as breakfast clubs are for primary schools, hunger doesn't end at 11. Does either of you think that we should be extending provision of free school meals, because that goes right up to 18?
Can I just add to your first question and then deal with that? Is that possible? Yeah. Just in terms of the QTS, we agree with what Julia said, but other than to add, we think it's a legitimate expectation of pupils and parents that they're taught by someone who's qualified to do so, and therefore the provisions in the bill that people travel towards that and become a qualified teacher is very, very important. I think that has a marginal impact on recruitment and retention, frankly, that necessity. But recruitment and retention is so much more than the flexibilities that may or may not be allowed to academy change under paying conditions. They are used at the moment sparingly and judiciously. We've got no objection to how they've been used so far. But those flexibilities, again, have a marginal impact. It's much more about workload, stress, the stress of accountability, and flexibility within employment that affects recruitment and retention rather than those flexibilities. On the breakfast...
6 people. I think Neil has a quick question, then 6 more people.
Julie, you said the bill currently delivers floor, not ceiling. Would you welcome it if we all put through an amendment to make that very clear?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. Amanda?
Thank you, Chair. I kind of want to touch on the legal basis that would bring into this bill. So what is the importance in the bill in providing a clear legal basis for sharing information for the purpose of safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children?
Start. Yeah. We absolutely support this. I mean, the statutory duty for schools and education to be consulted in that respect is absolutely necessary, and it will widen kind of the voices within there. It's, after all, schools where children are most present, they're most visible, and teachers and school leaders already play a role in noticing changes and noticing issues, so absolutely.
Yeah, we feel the same way. I think the only thing I would add is it is a growing burden isn't the right word, because schools absolutely need to do it. It is a growing set of responsibilities on schools. We're hearing a lot, particularly about the pressures on designated safeguarding leads in schools, and while we also welcome schools having a statutory role here, I think we also need to recognise that schools will need support and sufficient resources, particularly to deliver that. Thank you.
Damien?
Thank you, Mr. Edward. QTS, so I did some rough calculations. I think it's 3.1% of teachers by full-time equivalents. I think in 2010, which happens to be the year the data series started, it was 3.2%. And on pay and conditions, no one seems to have come forward with any evidence of widespread use of schools paying less than what might be this floor condition. Just in your estimation, what problem was the government trying to solve with these two measures?
So I think you're asking the wrong people. I don't know what was in the minds of government. I'm responding
Paul,
to
you like to speculate.
Damien, you know me too well. You know me too well. I can't answer for what was in the minds of government. Broadly speaking, as I said, I think it's a legitimate expectation of parents that a teacher in front of their child is qualified to teach them. And in terms of the push from your government and this government, the idea of standards being the voice of parents and talking about doing this for the expectations of parents, I think that gets alongside that ambition, so to be welcomed. On the pay flexibilities, I mean, I think the debate around that is louder than it needs to be because of the point you make. We haven't really deviated much from the STCPD. The whole point of having an independent pay review body to establish what the floor should be has worked in that regard. We need it to offer more, obviously. We always would want to say that. I think where I would just say slightly different to the question about would we ask for an amendment for a floor and not a ceiling, I talk about a core rather than the floor. There should be a core of terms and conditions that mean that a teacher or a school leader is agile within the system and portable. We don't want people stuck. They can't move because the terms and conditions vary so widely. That would work against our ambition of delivering the very best education system and getting the best teachers in front of children.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with anything there. I think core is a better term. It suggests not a minimum but a core entitlement. I think that's right. Yes, in terms of paying conditions, I think that we hear from our members that some of them have exercised some upward flexibilities and they're keen to be able to continue to do that, you know, to recognise the context in which they're operating. So that they are keen to maintain that while keeping that core. And QTS, yes, it is a very small number, but where that number exists, it probably is, you know, there might be reasons for it. So I think recognising that balance between wanting, of course, a fully qualified profession, but recognising some of the nuance there.
The measures in this bill on flexibilities for schools, on academies, on the national curriculum, I think a lot of people see as quite a dramatic change, quite a dramatic undoing of reforms made to the school system over the course of multiple governments the last couple of decades. Paul, you said in your opening remarks that this is not the revolution. So my question to you is, come the revolution, what should we expect to see in Labour's next bill?
Well, as a trade union that's politically independent and speaks to all of you, I have no insight on what might be in Labour's next bill. I think
that's not really a terribly serious question, David. So, sorry, Darren, come on, let's get on with it.
Serious question.
It's about the bill, this bill. We have to stick to this bill. Darren.
My apologies, Chair. Thank you. Very quickly on qualified teacher status, obviously the bill is about either having or working towards having that. Do you think it's a reasonable expectation that whatever your expertise and subject knowledge, that if you are teaching, you are trained to teach? Do you think that remains a reasonable expectation?
I think in the vast majority of cases, yes. Quite what that working towards looks like, I think needs thinking about to ensure it doesn't exacerbate existing crises. I think the only exception I might look at, and I think there may be exceptions for this anyway, is at that very sort of top end of secondary into college vocational sphere, where I think there might be a slightly different set of skills needed in the people teaching those young people. But broadly, as a principle, yes, I would agree.
Okay, thank you. My main question really was about the safeguarding. I know from experience that the good relationships between the different agencies, particularly school and the local authority, are forged locally, and therefore they depend on, you know, a lot of almost like a bit of a lottery, I guess. Will mandating, do you think, resolve that issue? Will that satisfy leaders that you speak to and DSLs that you speak to, that they now have the position and the basis for a much stronger relationship through what's being mandated here?
So we do. I wouldn't go as far as to suggest it's a lottery, but there are differences of relationship and differences of quality of relationship. So putting it on a statutory footing will help. I think the one concern that we have is that schools are often seen as the thing that will fill any void that occurs or assume a greater responsibility. And what this is really about for us is making sure that through the conversations with those teams, the safeguarding teams, that all services that support children are there to help them, and schools have a voice in that, rather than assuming some of the responsibilities of the other agencies, which over time has happened more and more. So we see this as a positive step, but there is a risk there that somehow more and more responsibility is placed on schools, which wouldn't be correct.
I would strongly agree with that. We've been doing a lot of work with our members recently about the additional responsibilities that they have been taking on, and sometimes that have been sort of expected to take on, and sometimes they have felt they've had no choice but to take on because the agencies that would normally or previously perhaps have delivered on those services no longer exist or have incredibly long waiting lists. So, yeah, the relationships that might be improved through this measure are really important, but there's a huge capacity issue there as well.
So are those expectations clear enough, do you think?
I think they probably could be clearer.
Okay.
Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you. This bill talks about breakfast clubs but says nothing about free school meals more widely. Would you like to see expansion of eligibility for free school meals?
We would. Yeah,
Can you elaborate on
yes.
that?
Happily. We would like to see the expansion up to 18. So at the moment it's only up to 16. We would like to see it up to 18. And we would like to see it expanded to all children of families receiving universal credit.
So we're in a similar position. We absolutely accept the evidence that well-fed students perform better and work better. Our only concern is the level of funding that comes with it. It has to be funded properly, and the provision not just for buying the food, but to the extent to which there will be capital costs to make sure these things up and can be delivered properly are important.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm sure we all want to see, one thing we would all agree, I'm sure, is that we want to see high standards in every school for every child, whether it's in terms of academic attainment and achievement or safeguarding outcomes. In your view, broadly speaking, obviously we've got limited time, would this bill help or hinder that ambition for high and rising standards in every school for every child?
I certainly don't think it hinders. The extent to which it answers some of the struggles we've had over time about attendance and support for children, it will certainly help. I think often when we're discussing these things, the language is very unhelpful because most schools have high and rising standards actually already. It is a very, very small percentage of schools that are in real difficulty. And I think where my eye is drawn therefore is around provisions such as when intervention occurs, how that support occurs and whether that will help. And I absolutely think it will. Having alternatives to just one answer, I think will assist the local education economy, the local education effort to collaborate more and help more. I mean, one of the things we need to make sure we're doing much better with a fragmented system is encouraging more and more collaboration between different trusts and different schools.
Yeah, I certainly don't think there's things in here that hinder that. I think there are some things that will help. More broadly, I think a lot of the measures that would help with high and rising standards in schools actually sit outside of schools. They sit perhaps in the government's broader opportunity mission, and it links to the previous discussion around broader children's services, broader family services, children living in poverty. So, yeah, absolutely some helpful stuff here, but much of the answer probably lies in other parts of the government's work.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk about school improvement, and I think, Paul, you said earlier that you were confident in the RISE teams and that as a policy. When we FOI'd commitments to the RISE teams, we found that the East of England, where my constituency is, will have 4 people from RISE teams. Thousands of schools, probably hundreds, that are RI, and yet only 4 people. So can you qualify why you have confidence in the RISE teams to deliver a school improvement offer? And also, can you speak to what more in this bill you think could be done to ensure there is a proper school improvement offer?
So I'm not sure I have said that I have confidence in the RISE teams. I think I've referenced the RISE teams in having a role in improving standards, in that they will come and support as well. I mean, I don't know if there's a word-for-word record to check it, but if I suggested, or I was saying I had confidence that wasn't intended, I think the problem with the RISE teams and all of the kind of rollout of the intentions of the bill was how the practical application of the bill's provisions later on. And of course, making sure that those teams are properly resourced and properly funded is a challenge going forward to make sure they work. There are other issues about the context in which they work, and I think the change of context from the discussion of intervention to the discussion of support is a much more positive footing for those teams to interact with schools locally.
Can I come in on that as well? So I think it's important to remember that the RISE teams are as much about triage as they are about delivering support. So I think that kind of recognition that I started with at the beginning, where the expertise sits in the system, which is largely within schools and trusts.
And do you think school improvement is best delivered in the DFE at a kind of big office somewhere, or do you think it's delivered in a school with people on location?
I think there's a role for both. I think there is a role for kind of central coordination and central support. If the RISE teams deliver, I think that is what they could provide. But I think that sort of on-the-ground support for schools does need to be done on the ground. And I think that links as well to sort of parallel conversations that are going on at the moment around how we might change inspection and accountability and doing more to recognise that role that schools and trusts play across the system in school improvement, not just in their own individual institutions.
Just to add very quickly, I don't see the RISE teams as just being the only participants in that school improvement. We see one of the roles of the RISE teams of identifying local practice that helps and trying to broker that collaboration that at the moment sometimes doesn't happen in the way that it might. So access to multi-academy trusts that do something very well to schools that aren't in there.
Academy Trust. So they're just replacing what was already going on.
Unfortunately, local academy trust looking outside their own boundary doesn't happen quite as often as we'd like to see it in terms of helping other schools that aren't part of their trust, unless they become formally part of that trust. What we need is more collaboration across all school types in local areas.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I think I am quoting you correctly to say that academisation wasn't a silver bullet. I wonder if you could elaborate on the factors that are in play where it hasn't worked in particular areas.
Well, the data we look at shows quality schools and improvement outside of the academy system as well as the academy system. And where you get particular schools that are very difficult to broker or have been rebrokered on a number of occasions, we have to have a different answer to that. And I think that therefore sits with the locality and the local education networks and economy to run to the aid of that school and try and improve it. I was also very careful to say that my comments on this aren't an attack on academies or the good work that they do. I think it's about finding the answer for the individual school.
But what is the difference with the maintained school? If that's sitting quite isolated around other academies, it hasn't got that place support around it. How does that work effectively, or better than rebrokering to another academy? Fairly.
Yeah. So for me, it's not necessarily about the legal status of the school. It's about the collaboration and support around that school from the rest of the education network and society around it. So where we see some really good work in the last few years is in the North East, and the way the North East has been building those networks around schools that happen to be in trust and schools that aren't in trust, and making sure that the support is delivered. And that way you can make, with the provisions in this bill, you can make different decisions about the school's legal status, but actually making sure the support is delivered in a way that works for that school.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank our witnesses. We'll now move on to the next set of witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
hear oral evidence from Jacky, Tiotto, Chief Executive of CAFCASS, Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you very much and good morning. And my name is Jacky Tiotto. I'm the Chief Executive of CAFCASS and have been there for 5.5 years now.
Thank you. Neil?
Good morning and thank you for coming. Clause 1 of this bill says that before a local authority in England makes an application for an order, it has to offer a family group decision-making meeting. Now, these meetings are generally a very good thing. They're in statutory guidance already. But I have two nagging worries about this as we move to mandate a good thing, as it were. The first is about pace, and I worry that either through people using the courts or their legal rights, some people will slow this down, or I worry that the local authority will sometimes worry about fulfilling this requirement when the priority should be the pace of getting a child away from a dangerous family. And I worry, on the other hand, that because we're saying that they should think about this and do more of these meetings just before they put an order in, you're at the point where actually that's not going to be that useful a meeting because you're already not into a consensual process, you're into a... and that actually we want to try and get local authorities to do this earlier more often. So do you have worries about particularly pace here, particularly for young, very vulnerable children?
Yes.
And could we amend this to try and address some of those nagging doubts I've got?
Yeah, I think they're good doubts to have. I should say at this point, though, CAFCASS isn't involved before the application to court's been issued, so it doesn't technically affect the work that we do. But clearly, when the proceedings are issued, we are interested in why they've been issued and what's not happened for the child. I think our position is that if you are introducing something that is largely consensual about engaging people in the care of children in their family at a point when you're going to formalise a letter that says if you don't act now we may remove your children, I think it will be very confusing. And I think as drafted, the bill probably could move it down to the point at which there's formal child protection procedures starting so that the family can get to know what the concerns are, can work with the child protection plan for longer and understand what the concerns are and demonstrate whether the protection can happen. I think the second point, though, if it were to stay as drafted at the edge of care, I think there are risks for very young children, babies in particular. These meetings will be difficult to set up. People won't turn up.
What's the average length of time?
I don't know, but I would think it's a number of weeks.
And does a number of weeks, is that sometimes potentially a dangerous thing?
Well, for very young children, where you are concerned, if they are still with the parents, which is sometimes the case, or even if they're with a foster carer, you want permanent decisions quickly, and that doesn't negate the need for the family to be involved. You just can have it much earlier because you've been worried for a while at that point.
As it were, if you had the pen and you could just get this bill into exactly the way that you would draft it, with lots of experience in this world, you would change it so that we move this thing in clause 1, part 1, so that it was focused on the point where there is initial child protection conversations rather than in addition to where it is. So rather than, okay, that is incredibly helpful. Is there anything else you would do to amend this bill?
There were a few bits I'd be good to talk about, but I don't know if you've got a set of questions.
No, my real question is, what would your amendments be to it?
Okay.
Essentially what we're all trying to find out is how we should change it as the bill goes through to committee.
Okay, well, if I speak too much, because I think this is a great opportunity that we've got, then please interrupt me. But I think just to go back to family group decision making and to make a point about CAFCASS. So we are the largest children's social work organisation in England, and we see 140,000 children through proceedings every year. And the bill tends to focus on those who are in public law proceedings. 2/3 of the children that we work with are in private law proceedings, so where there are family disputes about who children spend their time with and where they live. And very often those children are in families where conflict is very intense. There are risks to them. There is domestic abuse. And the bill is silent on children in private law proceedings, and I think there is an opportunity for that to be different. And one suggestion I would like to make on CAFCASS's behalf is that family group decision making is offered to families where the court has ordered a Section 7 report, which is a welfare report that if they order it to the local authority has to produce for the court in respect of what it advises about where children should live and who they should spend time with. And I think the opportunity for a family group decision-making meeting for those families is important. So just put that on the table if I can. I'd like to talk a bit about Clause 10, which is deprivation of liberty. I don't know if you've spoken about it yet, but obviously CAFCASS is involved in 98% of those applications. And to give you just a sense of the span, last year there were 1,200 applications to deprive a child of their liberty. As you will know from the research briefing, I'm sure that's about an 800% increase since 2017 because the provision to secure children is not there. And so this is a welcome change to Section 25, but I think it's a missed opportunity to deal with the arrangements around deprivation. And I think there could be some better, stronger regulations made for those children who, let's face it, are actually being secured or deprived of their liberty. Now, our data is that 20% of those children are under the age of 13 or 13 and under. And currently, if a local authority applies for a place in a secure unit for a child aged 13 or less, the Secretary of State for Education has to approve that application. I think there's an assumption made in the bill that strength would remain in the amendment, and I think we need to make it clear that for all applications for these children into places where they will be deprived, for 13 and unders, the Secretary of State should still approve, and that has been not necessary because the courts have been using their jurisdiction to deprive children, and this clause will remove that, make the accommodation usable legally, but we need to make sure that for young children it comes back. So that's one point. I think the second point is that for those young children, the review of their deprivation should be stipulated in terms of how regularly that deprivation is reviewed. A 10-year-old deprived of their liberty, a week is a long time. How the children that we work with tell us that they don't know what they have to do to not be deprived of their liberty, and very young children will be confused. So the frequency of review, I think, becomes more regular if you're younger. And I very much feel that the Department for Education should definitely consider what has happened to that child before the deprivation application is made. From our data, only 7% of those children were the subject of child protection plans, and it's hard to imagine going from not being protected through a statutory child protection plan to then being in a court where they might deprive you. So the relationship between child protection and deprivation needs strengthening. And what
would that look like? Is that do you have to do a sort of case review, or is it that...
Well, that as soon as that child becomes a subject of a concern such that you might be applying for an application to deprive, you have a child protection conference and you have a plan in place to protect that child beyond the deprivation, so including and beyond, helps with the exit. And the final point is the type of people who apply to run this provision as amended. Ofsted need to be really sure of who they are, what their experience is. I've run this provision. I've worked in it. These kids are really needy. They need very specialist, highly qualified people, and at the moment the provision that they get is not run by those sorts of people.
Okay, Stephen.
Thank you, Jacky. Thanks for presenting evidence to the committee. 2 questions from me, if I may. One around local authorities, then the second on kinship. On local authorities, what impact do you think mandating local authorities to offer a family group decision-making meeting will have on families and children?
I think the intention to be family-centred and to promote the best place for children to grow up in their families is a good one. As I've said, I think it's too late at that point when, you know, you're in a panic, you're going to get a letter that says we may remove your children. You're going to engage very differently at that point than if you are involved earlier. So I think it's a good thing. The problem with mandation is that just because you say it has to happen doesn't necessarily mean people will come. It doesn't necessarily offer protection to children. So I think the principle is right, but how it becomes operationalised will be important.
That's really helpful. On kinship then, you'll be familiar with the independent review of children in social care and the recommendation around kinship carers receiving greater recognition and support. There's obviously a number of measures in the bill to that regard. What impact do you think the bill will have on kinship care and those that care for those in kinship?
Well, I think it's fantastic to be acknowledging those people who often give up a big chunk of their lives to look after those children, and formalising the offer for them is a no-brainer, really. For CAFCASS, we clearly will be involved in assessing some of those carers if they've come into proceedings and have been named through the proceedings. We'll be assessing them as we do special guardians now, so all to the good.
Thank you, Chair.
Vinira.
CAFCASS seeks to make sure that decisions are made in the best interest of the child and the child is heard. How child-centred do you think the legislation is as drafted, in particular with regards to family group decision making?
Yeah, I was thinking about this on the way here. I think the intention to be child-centred is great, but I think there is confusion. If you look at advice that exists now, say from the Ministry of Justice, about the meeting that you would have in pre-proceedings about removal of your children, the advice is not to bring your children, because you'd be in a meeting where something scary would be being discussed. So you can understand that advice. Perhaps the week before now, we may have a family group decision making where I think the plan is to encourage children to come, and I think there needs to be more thought given to how children will experience family group decision making. And to the point about it being earlier, I think there should be a very special provision drafted about the need to seek children's views and present them in that meeting. Whether they come or not, I think, is a matter for local authorities to decide, but very critically, the adult voices will become the loudest if the children don't present a view.
So the bill as drafted says that the child may attend a meeting if the local authority deems it appropriate. Would you agree with me that it should be the default that the child should attend unless the local authority thinks it's inappropriate?
Yes, but with care.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I follow up on the Minister's question on kinship?
Sure.
And you say that you support those relatives who may be involved in cases to look after children. It's great that there's going to be a local offer that's published by every local authority, but every local authority, frankly, has a different offer.
Yeah.
What more do you think we could be doing to ensure that more kinship carers can step up and support children who otherwise would end up in local authority care?
Gosh, okay. Well, I think we have to go back to the needs of the children, and they're pretty significant in large part. When a local authority becomes involved on behalf of the state, they're worried, and there will be matters of children not going to school, There'll be matters of them being at risk from criminal and sexual exploitation. There'll be some quite serious issues in their lives if they're older children. If they're younger children, not so much so. But nevertheless, the kinship carer's life won't continue in the way it has before in terms of the ability to work maybe or where they live. And local authorities are under huge resource pressure, we know, so I think there's going to have to be something a bit stronger to encourage people to become carers, whether that's related to housing, whether that's related to the cost of looking after those children. I think people will want to do the right thing, but if you've already got 3 kids of your own, it becomes tricky. So I think it has to be about resource and support, and not just financial resource, but access to, much better mental health support for those children and the carers.
Thank you.
Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. I kind of want to take a step back from where you would really be involved, I think, is what do you think the impact will be of creating the duty of safeguarding partnership to make arrangements to establish multi-agency child protection teams?
Yeah, it is a long way back from us, but I was a Director of Children's Services before this, so we were always clamouring to have a much more formal arrangement with the police and with health. So it's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to get this resourced and to put child protection formally back on the platform it was, which is multi-agency. I mean, we've got Working Together, which is the best multi-agency guidance in the world, but it's been hard to express without that mandation. So, thumbs up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ellie.
Thank you, Chair. Follows up a little bit from Amira's question. My question really was, do you think this bill does enough to centre the voices of children? You've talked particularly about that in terms of FGTM. Are there other aspects of the bill where you'd like to see amendments made?
Well, deprivation of liberty, definitely. I think, if I may say something about elective home education and also the staying close provision, I think the bill intention to formalise elective home education is long overdue, and I think children's views about that education should be well and truly sought before any decision is taken to permit it. I think it's a bit permissive at the minute in terms of Section 47, which is how it's drafted. I think if the local authorities had cause to think you have been and now established that you've been significantly harmed or are at risk of significant harm, then on no day of any week could it be okay for you to be out of sight being educated somewhere else. So I think it should be a flat no if you're on a child protection plan. If you're a child in need, so under Section 17, I think that there should be more regular review of that child in need plan if you are being electively home educated. But every time, that child should be asked how it's going. Is this helping you? Are you feeling safe? And I think more generally, at every one of these points where we're mandating something about safety, the first thing should be is what is the view of the child? And if the child can't speak or is a baby, then somebody with the ability to speak on their behalf should be asked. And I think we should tick nothing off without that being the case.
Thank you. And you also staying close?
Yes. Again, another welcome introduction and formalisation. CAFCASS obviously is involved with 25,000 children a year in public law proceedings. I think that it would be nice, if possible, if the drafters could require CAFCASS to at the end of proceedings, in their closing letter to the independent reviewing officer, say that we think, having got to know this child, that X, Y or Z would be appropriate provision for them in terms of staying close, because we will have got to know and had a relationship with that child throughout their proceedings. Also, when we are asked to discharge care orders, which we, is 10% of our work. Again, I think asking us to write back to the local authority as the child's guardian and say, this child will not benefit from being housed 45 miles away or will need access to grandma. I think that asking us to do that at the end of proceedings would be an important addition to whether it's regulations or guidance, but I think we're a bit missed from the process, and we bring that voice of the child. Yeah.
Thank you. If I might, Chair, just one small one. What about the idea of expanding staying put in addition to expansion of staying close?
All good.
You'd like to see that too, because that's missing from this bill.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've worked with many children who are terrified of the cliff edge of 18.
Yeah.
In fact, they start worrying about it at 16.
Yeah.
And it often blights the last few years of their care.
So what would you like to see, ideally?
Just the provision mandated to 21 everywhere.
Okay.
Probably shot for saying that, but I think...
Or even beyond 21.
Well, yes. Yeah, I don't... Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine?
I think we've seen the number of children in care rising really significantly. Looking at the child protection measures and the kinship clauses and also the family group conferencing, what do you feel the overall impact of the introduction of this bill will have on the numbers of children in care?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because we have got primary legislation in the 1989 Children Act that says the best place for children, we think, in this country is growing up in their family or with relatives. And I think when the 30-year review of the Children Act happened, people still signed up to that. So this bill definitely reminds us and provokes that intention again. I think that the difficulty is that the formality around protecting children is burdensome, and rightly so. So some of the construction of this has to be, in my view, a bit more thoughtful about the children who are going to do well in their families and the children who really aren't going to stand a chance and need quickly to move to permanence and to other places. Now, residential care is not doing particularly well, I don't think, here for children with very special needs. We struggle to recruit foster carers because the resources around them aren't there. So I think it's the shape of what's around those other places that aren't residential care, if you like, that needs to be elevated in order to reduce the number of children coming into care. Just having family group decision-making conferences or kinship alone isn't enough. I don't think anyone's saying it is. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Chief Social Worker paper a few years ago called Clear Blue Water, where, there was a very good, strong case made for don't come into court with children where you're going to end up either where they're back at home or with a supervision order that gives no statutory power to the local authority. Come into court for the kids that really need a care order and protection and to go somewhere. And I think we could revisit the extent to which that is an effective situation. And a third of children who come into family proceedings now either remain at home or go back home. Now, I make no judgment about that, but a third of children going through family proceedings is expensive. And we need to think about what was the point of issue, what was needed at the time, and will the serving of that order deal with the problem at the time. And often what's gone wrong in child protection won't be solved just by making a court order, particularly a supervision order. And I could be here for a long time on those, but there's another bill, probably another day.
Darren?
Thank you, Chair. Jacky, the bill proposes a number of measures around illegal children's homes and a a topic that you've already mentioned a couple of times, deprivation of liberty, when that doesn't necessarily need to be in a secure children's home. What are your reflections on how effective that's going to be in terms of protecting vulnerable children, and in particular, do you foresee any impact on family court proceedings if there's now a different outcome in terms of what judges can decide on those?
I don't think the strengthening of Section 25 so that other accommodation can be used that's not a secure children's home. But I think there is a gross underestimation of how intensive it is to look after those children. And that's not just a today thing. It's been coming for 20 years when we stopped running children's homes in local authorities, really. So I think the provision of the accommodation in the way that the bill sets out is good. But as I said before, who runs it and how much the staffing costs are for running very specialist provision.
I'm afraid on the programme motion we have to end exactly.
Okay.
I apologise. Thank you very much.
No, it's okay.
Sitting is suspended until 2 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody.